You know that feeling when you're just trying to get through the day, maybe, but it feels like you're constantly dodging little landmines?
Hmm.
That sense of being on edge, maybe even a bit overwhelmed, and just, well, wishing you had a clearer understanding of what sets you off.
Yeah, absolutely. That feeling of wanting more control.
Exactly. So today we're taking a deep dive into something that's really key to regaining that sense of control, particularly if you're navigating addiction recovery, understanding and managing your triggers.
And we've got a really rich set of resources to explore this. We're looking at like practical guidance from an addiction workbook, which has
Mhm.
some great frameworks and exercises.
Okay.
We'll also be pulling insights from articles looking at internal versus external triggers, especially in uh, pornography, addiction help contexts,
Right.
and another one called Understanding Triggers Hopeful Mom. Plus, we're considering a study connecting loneliness and problematic use.
Loneliness, yeah, that comes up a lot.
It does. And another piece suggesting porn might be used as a kind of existential escape for boredom.
Wow,
Right.
existential escape. Okay.
And to make this really relatable, we're even looking at a Reddit thread where people share their very personal experiences with triggers,
Good.
real world stuff.
That's great. So, our goal today is really to distill all of this into practical strategies that you can actually use.
Hmm.
We want to equip you with a clear way to identify those specific cues, those triggers that can spark cravings and urges, and maybe more importantly, figure out how to navigate them, to support your recovery and overall well being.
Right.
Okay, so let's jump in. What exactly are these triggers we're talking about? It sounds a bit like a buzzword, but what's the real deal?
Well, essentially, triggers are signals they can come from inside you or from your environment that kind of kickstart cravings or urges to engage in addictive behaviors.
Okay, signals.
Yeah. The article on internal versus external triggers gives us that basic definition. What's really interesting, though, is that some of these signals are obvious, right? Like walking past a bar if you're trying to avoid alcohol.
Sure, makes sense.
But, as the addiction workbook points out, many can be much more subtle, almost like little mental whispers you barely notice sometimes.
Right, those sneaky little things that catch you off guard. And it's not just about what's happening around us, is it?
No, definitely not.
I remember coming across the ARIL acronym. I think it was in the Ultimate Guide to Identifying. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired.
Yes, ELT.
That feels like a really useful starting point for just checking in with yourself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. AKLT is a great initial filter because it highlights those common internal states that can lower our defenses, make us more susceptible to triggers.
Okay.
But to really get a handle on this, we need to dig deeper into both what's going on inside us and what's happening in our surroundings.
Makes sense.
So maybe let's start by focusing on those internal triggers.
Okay, sounds good. So internal triggers.
Yeah,
When we say internal, are we talking about our feelings, our physical state, things like that?
exactly. Internal triggers are those emotions, physical sensations, or maybe unmet needs that just sort of bubble up from within us.
Right.
The internal versus external triggers article really emphasizes that these often arise from some underlying discomfort or emotional pain that maybe hasn't been fully processed.
Can you give us some concrete examples? What kind of feelings are we really talking about here?
Well, the sources give us quite a wide range. We're looking at things like depression, that heavy sense of sadness,
Mhm.
or shame, that feeling of being fundamentally flawed,
Oh, shame.
anxiety, that constant worry, anger, fear, guilt, remorse. These are all mentioned in that internal versus external triggers piece.
Okay.
And the addiction workbook adds to this list with feelings of boredom, which might seem minor, but it can be a really powerful trigger for some people.
Boredom. Interesting.
Yeah, and also those deeper, often unspoken needs for things like feeling validated or getting affection, connecting with others, even just that feeling of inadequacy, like you're not good enough.
That really resonates. So if you're feeling isolated and lonely, that could actually set off an urge.
Precisely. And this study on loneliness and problematic pornography use directly supports that connection. It's a strong link.
Huh.
What's also quite revealing is the link between boredom and addiction.
Yeah.
One of the articles we looked at, I think it was on SciPost, suggested that for some, pornography can become what they call an existential escape.
Existential escape.
Right.
Right, you mentioned that.
Yeah, when they're wrestling with the sense that their life lacks meaning. Boredom in this context isn't just about, having nothing to do. It can signal a deeper feeling of a lack of purpose.
Wow.
And the mind tries to fill that void, sometimes in unhealthy ways.
Existential escape. That's a really profound way to put it. So it's not always just about the immediate physical gratification then.
Not necessarily, no. The research indicates that pornography, for example, can be used as a way to avoid difficult emotions. sort of a way to distract ourselves from life's challenges,
Mm-hmm.
or to seek out a burst of excitement when things feel dull, and of course for sexual pleasure too.
Mm.
The addiction workbook also touches on this, explaining that addiction can function as a way to numb those really deep-seated, painful emotions like hurt, fear, sadness, or shame.
Like using the addiction as a shield almost.
Exactly, a shield or a buffer.
Okay, so that's a lot going on inside. Now, what about the external stuff?
Yeah.
What kinds of things in our environment can act as triggers?
Right, external triggers. As the internal versus external triggers article explains, these are those factors in our environment. The things we see, the places we go, the people we're around, specific situations, or even particular events
Okay.
that can spark those urges.
Give us some clear examples. What kind of external things are we talking about? Like real world stuff?
Okay, think about being around certain individuals who might have been part of your past addictive behaviors. That's a common one.
Mm-hmm.
Or encountering sexualized media in pretty much any form, whether it's images or videos.
Yeah, that's everywhere.
It really is. Specific places that you associate with past use can also be very strong external triggers, maybe your bedroom or a certain room in the house.
Right.
Even seemingly neutral situations like feeling stressed at work or maybe in social settings can act as external triggers, especially if they tap into some underlying internal discomfort.
Right, the stress connection.
Yeah. And the Understanding Triggers Hopeful Mom article also points to seeing sexually suggestive images or, attractive people in real life.
Right.
Specific locations like maybe the beach or a friend's house where the behavior might have happened.
Okay.
And even particular times of day that were previously linked to the behavior can become triggers, like maybe late at night for some people.
And what about that Reddit thread? Were there any surprising or particularly specific external triggers that people shared there? Because that sounds like where the really specific stuff might come out.
Absolutely. That thread provided a really detailed and personal look at potential triggers. Beyond the more obvious ones, people mentioned specific online content.
Right.
Like Reddit itself, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, the image sharing site 9gag, the art platform DeviantArt, even certain types of anime and YouTube videos, music videos with suggestive content.
Yeah, music videos can be tricky.
Definitely. Platforms like Twitter, Tumblr, Dailymotion, remember Vines, even those.
Yeah.
Instagram, obviously. And even seemingly news-focused sites like HuffPost and BuzzFeed were cited.
BuzzFeed.
Apparently. And let's not forget just random ads that pop up on websites. It really highlights how pervasive these potential triggers can be, especially in our digital lives.
It really does sound like the online world is just saturated with potential external triggers. It's hard to avoid.
It can definitely feel that way. Interestingly, the Reddit thread even had a practical suggestion for dealing with triggering websites.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
Using a text mode browser, one that strips away all the images and videos, just leaves the text content.
Huh. A text mode browser. That's kind of old school, but I can see how that would work.
Yeah, takes away the visual element.
Okay, so we've got the internal stuff, our feelings, our needs, and the external stuff, our environment, the people, the places, the websites. Why is it actually so important to take the time to really identify our own personal triggers? Why does this matter so much?
Well, understanding your triggers is truly the fundamental first step towards gaining control over addictive behaviors and ultimately breaking free from that cycle.
Okay, the first step.
Yeah. Both the addiction workbook and the internal versus external triggers article really stress this point. When you start to recognize these patterns, the specific situations, the underlying emotions, the places you tend to be when cravings arise, you can begin to anticipate when a trigger might actually occur.
So you're not just blindsided all the time.
Exactly. It's about moving from simply reacting to becoming more aware and prepared.
So it's like knowing what you're up against, right? I think I remember seeing a quote about that somewhere.
Exactly. The ultimate guide to identifying actually quotes Sun Tzu, you know the one,
Know your enemy.
and know yourself. Yeah, understanding your triggers is a critical part of knowing your enemy in this context and knowing yourself. By recognizing those patterns, you can start to develop strategies to manage them more effectively before they lead to unwanted behaviors.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So how do we actually do that? What are some practical ways to start identifying these triggers, both the ones inside us and the ones around us? Where do you start?
Okay, well, when it comes to those internal triggers, several of our sources suggest some really helpful techniques. Journaling is a big one.
Definitely, okay.
Yeah, by regularly writing down your thoughts and feelings, you can become much more attuned to your own emotional landscape. You start to see connections, like what feelings or sensations tend to pop up right before those urges hit.
Right, noticing the patterns yourself.
Exactly. Therapy and counseling are also incredibly valuable. They provide a safe space to explore those unresolved emotions and unmet needs that often fuel internal triggers. Having a professional guide you through that.
Professional help.
And practices like mindfulness can help too. They help you become more aware of your present emotional and physical state, but without judgment. Just noticing those subtle shifts that might indicate a trigger is active.
Journaling, therapy, mindfulness. Those definitely sound like good ways to tune in to what's happening inside. What else might help with internal triggers? Anything else?
Yeah, the addiction workbook also emphasizes the importance of identifying your core values.
Your values.
Uh,
How does that help with triggers?
Well, when you have a clear understanding of what's truly important to you in life, like connection or health or integrity, it can provide a powerful source of motivation. It gives you direction in your recovery.
Ah, okay, so it gives you a why.
Exactly. A strong why. It helps you make choices that align with those values rather than just reacting to the immediate urge. And as we touched on earlier, the workbook strongly encourages exploring and processing those underlying emotions directly.
Instead of numbing them.
Right. Instead of trying to numb them or push them away through addictive behaviors, actually feel them and work through them.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're clear on what you truly care about and you're actually acknowledging what you're feeling, it seems like it would be easier to make choices that support your long-term well-being.
Definitely.
Now, what about those external triggers? The stuff outside of us. How do we get a handle on those? Because some seem unavoidable.
Right. For external triggers, the strategies often revolve around managing your environment as much as possible.
Right.
Avoiding triggers that you can reasonably avoid is a key first step.
Okay. Avoidance where possible.
The ultimate guide to identifying refers to this as situational awareness, basically being mindful of where you're going and what you might encounter there.
Got it.
Setting boundaries is also crucial.
Yeah.
This might involve limiting your exposure to triggering media, like maybe unfollowing certain social media accounts,
Yeah.
or avoiding certain social situations that, tend to lead to urges. That's highlighted in the internal versus external triggers article.
Avoidance sounds important, but like I said, what happens when you can't completely avoid a trigger? Something just pops up unexpectedly.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And that's where having specific response strategies comes in. The ultimate guide to identifying offers a really useful one. They call it the alert, avert, affirm strategy.
Alert, avert, affirm. How does that work?
Okay, so first, you recognize the trigger as soon as you become aware of it that's being alert.
Okay.
Second, if possible, you look away or physically remove yourself from the situation that's avert.
Get out of there.
Right. And third, you consciously affirm your commitment to your recovery. You acknowledge your strength in resisting the urge that's affirm.
Alert, avert, affirm. I like that. It sounds really proactive, like you have a concrete plan.
It is. And the guide also suggests using filtering software on your digital devices, which we talked about briefly.
Right, the filter?
And connecting with accountability partners or using apps that can help you limit access to triggering content, having someone else in the loop.
Okay. Are there any general coping strategies that can be helpful for dealing with both internal and external triggers? Kind of like an all-purpose toolkit?
Absolutely. Both the Addiction Workbook and the Understanding Triggers Hopeful Mom article provide a number of general coping mechanisms that can be really effective in the moment.
Like what?
Well, physically removing yourself from the immediate situation is often a powerful first step. Just changing your environment.
Get up and walk away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Techniques like deep breathing exercises, really focusing on your breath, and grounding techniques can help bring you back to the present moment when you feel overwhelmed.
Grounding techniques, like the 5-4-3-2-1 thing.
Precisely. The 5-4-3-2-1 method, where you identify 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. It pulls your focus away from the internal chaos and back to your senses.
Those grounding techniques sound particularly helpful for when you feel that surge of anxiety or a really intense urge. What else can we add to our toolkit?
Reaching out. Contacting a trusted support person, whether it's a friend, a family member, maybe a sponsor or a therapist, can provide immediate support and also a crucial distraction.
Just talking it through.
Yeah, breaking the isolation. Engaging in distracting activities that occupy both your mind and your body, like exercise or hobbies, can also be very effective in just riding out the urge until it passes.
Okay. Distraction.
Progressive muscle relaxation can help release physical tension that often comes along with stress and urges, tensing and releasing different muscle groups. And reframing negative thoughts, consciously replacing them with positive affirmations, is a powerful tool for shifting your mindset in that moment.
Changing the internal script.
Exactly. Reminding yourself of your commitment to recovery, maybe vividly visualizing positive future outcomes, can also strengthen your resolve when you feel weak.
Okay.
And finally, the Addiction Workbook introduces a really helpful skill for managing impulsivity called SWP.
Stop. OP. What does that stand for?
It stands for Stop What You're Doing, Take a Breath, Observe Your Thoughts and Feelings Without Judgment, and then proceed mindfully with a conscious choice.
Stop. Take a breath. Observe. Proceed. The SOPP skill.
That sounds like a really practical way to just create a pause, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It does. It breaks that automatic reaction.
Make a deliberate choice instead of just reacting on autopilot. Now, going back to that Reddit thread again, because it sounds fascinating, there were some incredibly specific triggers people shared. Were there also any solutions or insights that came along with those very specific triggers?
Yes, definitely. There were some very practical, almost user-generated solutions that offer a real glimpse into the kind of nitty-gritty of managing triggers day to day.
Okay, like what?
Well, for those biological or physical triggers, like not getting enough sleep,
Yeah.
the clear solution was, well, prioritize sleep hygiene. Make sleep a priority. For the discomfort of a full bladder acting as a trigger for some, the advice was straightforward. Just go to the bathroom when you need to, don't hold it.
Seems obvious, but maybe not when you're in the moment.
Right. Shaving genitals was identified by some as a trigger due to subsequent irritation, and the suggestion was maybe avoid it during the initial, more vulnerable stages of recovery.
Interesting.
Missing meals leading to low blood sugar and decreased willpower. That was addressed with the recommendation to maintain regular healthy eating habits, keep your energy stable.
Makes sense.
Even something as seemingly random as toilet paper sticking was mentioned.
Seriously?
Seriously, with the humorous but practical solution of simply hopping in the shower instead of repeatedly rubbing, which could apparently be a tactile trigger for some.
Wow, some of those are incredibly specific. It really highlights how personal triggers can be. What about some of the behavioral triggers that were discussed on Reddit, things people do?
Right, behavioral triggers. These included things like taking your phone or computer to bed. The suggested solution: establish a tech-free zone in the bedroom. Keep it for sleep.
Good boundary.
Spending too much time alone was countered with the advice to actively seek out opportunities for connection, even if it's just a brief interaction with someone.
Break the isolation pattern.
Exactly. The idea of slippery slope behaviors, like looking at mildly suggestive content thinking, oh, this isn't so bad, was met with a pretty firm warning. Don't start. Just avoid it altogether.
Yeah, that slippery slope is real.
Using the computer in complete isolation was addressed by suggesting maybe use it in more communal spaces in the home if possible. Experiencing long work sessions leading to mental fatigue. The recommendation was take regular breaks, incorporate some physical activity.
Get up, move around.
Yeah. Even habits around showering and using the bathroom were identified by some as potential triggers. Suggestions included things like using a sponge instead of direct touch during vulnerable times, and just being mindful of the amount of time spent in the bathroom.
Wow.
And finally, browsing recovery forums in incognito mode.
Why incognito?
Well, the thought was it could indicate a lack of full commitment, kind of hiding it. So it was flagged as risky, with the suggestion to stay logged in openly as a form of accountability, even to yourself.
These are such incredibly practical insights. They really feel like they come from that lived experience, you know?
They absolutely do.
What about the psychological and emotional triggers that were brought up on Reddit? The stuff going on in people's heads?
Yeah, those are powerful too. Things like rationalizing relapse when feeling aroused.
The just this once thought.
Exactly. And the solution offered was to consciously challenge those thoughts, recognize them for what they are, and remember the potential for the chaser effect, that intensified craving that can follow a slip-up.
Right, the chaser effect. Important to remember.
Thinking about past partners or fantasizing about triggering scenarios. That was addressed by actively redirecting those thoughts. Consciously shift your focus to something else, anything else.
Okay, redirection.
Feeling unwanted emotions like anger, boredom, or sadness. The suggestions were things like practicing mindfulness, accepting the emotion without judgment, just letting it be there, and focusing on simply getting through the present moment without acting on it.
Just ride the wave.
Ride the wave. Ironically, overthinking the need to not think about porn became a trigger for some.
Like the pink elephant problem.
Exactly. And the advice was just to shift focus, engage in other activities, stop trying so hard not to think about it. Procrastination as a form of escape was reframed as merely delaying the inevitable task, encouraging people to just tackle it head on.
Get it done.
Loneliness was addressed by creating and actively engaging in a list of activities that foster connection. And feelings of rejection were reframed as opportunities to build self-worth through positive self-care actions.
It really sounds like across all these triggers, whether they're physical, behavioral, or emotional, that awareness and having proactive strategies for redirection are just key.
Absolutely. Awareness and having a plan.
Now, what about the role of social triggers that were mentioned on the Reddit thread? Things involving other people or situations.
Right, social triggers. These included things like rationalizing a relapse after having a really successful day.
Like a reward.
Kind of, yeah, a faulty reward system. And the solution was to consciously challenge that faulty logic. Stress in social situations was addressed by finding healthier coping mechanisms other than resorting to addictive behaviors.
Plan ahead for stressful events.
Exactly. Being hungover was identified as a big trigger for some, making them more vulnerable. The obvious advice was practice moderation or maybe abstain from alcohol altogether if it's a consistent issue.
Hmm.
Even the physical sensation of waking up with morning wood was a trigger for some, and the advice was simple. Get out of bed immediately, don't linger, and avoid reaching for the phone first thing.
Breaks the pattern.
Break the pattern.
Huh.
Surprisingly, even talking to an attractive person was mentioned as a potential trigger for some,
Wow.
with the advice to mindfully acknowledge the exposure. Oh, okay, I noticed that. And then consciously shift your thoughts elsewhere. And finally, the feeling of experiencing a surge of confidence or superpowers after a period of abstinence.
A superpowers thing from NoFap forums.
Yeah, exactly. That feeling could actually lead to carelessness or seeking external validation in unhealthy ways. So the counter was the need for consistent mindfulness and humility. Don't get cocky.
It's really quite eye-opening just how many seemingly ordinary things can potentially act as triggers for different people. It's so individual.
It really is.
Now, something that often comes up, especially in the context of addiction, is shame. How does this powerful emotion play into this whole cycle of triggers and behaviors we've been talking about?
Oh, shame is. It's a really damaging emotion, and it often fuels the entire cycle of addiction. Massively.
Ever so.
Well, as the overcoming shame section in the addiction workbook explains so clearly, it's that deep-seated feeling that you're fundamentally flawed, unworthy, or just incapable of change.
Like something's wrong with you, not just your behavior.
Exactly. And that shame creates this sense of isolation and self-loathing, which can then drive you to seek temporary relief or escape through those addictive behaviors.
Right, trying to numb the shame.
But then the negative consequences of those behaviors often just intensify the very feelings of shame you were trying to escape. It creates this really destructive, vicious cycle, downward spiral.
So it's like a negative feedback loop that just keeps pulling you down.
Exactly right. That's why confronting shame, but confronting it with self-compassion, is so absolutely crucial for healing and breaking free from this cycle.
Self-compassion, not self-criticism.
Precisely. The Addiction Workbook offers some really insightful exercises to help with this. There's a creative one about drawing your shame monster.
Drawing it.
Yeah, as a way to kind of externalize that abstract feeling, make it less overwhelming, maybe give it a silly name, and also actively practicing self-compassion, consciously treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a close friend who is struggling.
Drawing a shame monster.
Yep.
That sounds like a surprisingly powerful way to make that feeling less abstract and maybe more manageable.
It can be, yeah, giving it form.
What about the importance of setting goals? The Addiction Workbook talks about SMART goals.
Yeah.
How do those fit into this process of managing triggers?
Setting SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, is really essential for creating a focused and motivated plan for recovery. It gives structure. The workbook emphasizes that these goals should be directly aligned with your individual recovery needs and your deeply held long-term values, which we talked about earlier.
Connecting back to your why.
Exactly. By setting clear and attainable goals, you can effectively track your progress, maintain your motivation, and build a sense of momentum as you learn to manage your triggers and work towards your overall well-being. It makes it feel less overwhelming.
So instead of just having a vague intention like, I want to stop doing this, you'd set a SMART goal. Like, this week, I will identify 3 specific personal triggers that I've noticed, maybe write them down, and develop at least one concrete coping strategy for each of them.
Precisely. That goal is specific. Identify triggers, develop strategies,
Yeah.
measurable, 3 triggers, 1 strategy each. It's achievable, it's relevant to understanding and managing triggers, and it's time-bound this week. It gives you a clear focus and something tangible to work towards. Much more effective.
Okay, we've talked about identifying triggers, developing coping skills, setting effective goals. What about those negative thought patterns that can really fuel addiction? The workbook mentions cognitive restructuring. What's that about?
Yeah, cognitive restructuring is a really powerful technique. It's about learning to challenge and ultimately change those negative thought patterns that so often contribute to addictive behaviors. They often happen automatically.
Challenging your own thoughts.
Right. The workbook describes it as a step-by-step process. First, you recognize those negative thoughts as they arise. Just notice them. Then, you carefully examine the evidence. What supports this thought? What contradicts it? Is it really true?
Okay, questioning it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, you develop healthier, more balanced, and more constructive alternative ways of thinking. You actively replace the unhelpful thought.
So you're breaking the link.
Precisely. By learning to identify and reframe these unhelpful thought patterns, you can break that strong link between encountering a trigger, having an automatic negative thought, and then experiencing an overwhelming urge to engage in the addictive behavior.
So if a trigger pops up and the automatic negative thought is something like, I just can't cope with this feeling, I need to escape.
Mm-hmm.
Cognitive restructuring would involve questioning that thought, asking yourself, is it really true I can't cope? What evidence do I have that I can cope? What skills do I have? And then maybe replacing it with something more realistic and empowering, like this feeling is difficult, but I do have coping skills I can use, and I've gotten through tough times like this before.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. It's about consciously shifting your internal dialogue from one that reinforces the addiction and feelings of helplessness to one that actively supports your recovery and builds your sense of self-efficacy, your belief that you can handle it.
This has been such an incredible, insightful discussion. It really sounds like managing triggers as well. It's a very active and ongoing process, isn't it?
It really is.
It requires a good dose of self-awareness, careful planning, consistent effort. It's not passive.
Not at all. It's work, but it's empowering work.
What would you say is the most important final takeaway for our listeners today, if they remember one thing?
I think the key takeaway is this. Developing a deep understanding of your individual triggers, both those that originate from within you, those internal ones, and those that exist in your surrounding environment, the external ones, is an absolutely fundamental and incredibly powerful first step.
The first step again?
Yeah, it truly is foundational. It's the path towards lasting positive change and greater self-awareness. It's about consciously shifting from a place of simply reacting to your urges to becoming much more proactive and intentional in your recovery journey. Taking the reins back.
Taking the reins back. I like that. So as you're reflecting on everything we've discussed today, I want to leave you with this thought. Consider the most unexpected trigger you've ever encountered, or perhaps one that you can now anticipate more clearly after this conversation. How might taking the time to truly understand its root, whether it's, a hidden emotion you've been avoiding, a seemingly insignificant environmental cue you hadn't noticed, or even a recurring thought pattern, how might that deeper understanding contribute to your ongoing journey of personal growth and recovery?
That's a great question for reflection.
We really encourage you to delve further into the resources we've touched upon today, and more importantly, to continue actively exploring your own unique landscape of triggers. Because it's really in that dedicated understanding that genuine control and lasting change truly become possible.